I never thought I'd be the kind of person who'd tell a story like this. Corporate betrayal is something you expect in headlines, not in conference rooms where you've spent years building something with your own hands. But I guess that's the point. Nobody thinks it'll be them. Nobody thinks they'll be the one smiling politely while someone else rewrites their legacy in real time. I've always been a numbers guy, not the charismatic type who gets applause in meetings, or the politician who survives on handshakes and hallway gossip. I was the guy who stayed late to fix the revenue allocation logic, because no one else understood how the cross-regional storage charges worked. The guy who built tools instead of stories. The one who solved things quietly. And for a long time, that was enough. The division wasn't glamorous. $4 million in annual revenue is nothing in a company that measures success in quarters of a billion. But I knew every line of it, every contract clause, every operational loophole that cost us hours, every vendor dependency that could sink us if someone pushed the wrong button. When I took it over, the reports were a mess. The deliveries were delayed. The client satisfaction scores were trending toward lawsuits. 2 years later, we were not only stable, we were outperforming older, bigger units. It wasn't magic. It wasn't a genius moment. It was the boring kind of leadership that never gets praised until something breaks. Hiring the right coordinators, fixing workflows, documenting what others ignored, and telling the truth even when the truth was inconvenient. People respected that. Or at least I thought they did. The CEO rarely acknowledged me, but I didn't need her praise. I wasn't chasing a title. I was building a system. But I could feel things shifting around me in ways that didn't make sense at first. The way she lit up when Eric walked into a meeting, the way she asked him questions she should have asked me, the way she invited him to offsites I later learned about, through leftover agendas in the printer tray. Eric had the kind of charm that plays well in leadership rooms. Soft voice, rehearsed humility, and a father-of-two image that executives love because it makes them feel they're rewarding good people. He joined a year after me, came from a competing firm with a questionable reputation, and had a habit of taking credit for what his team delivered. But he had one skill I didn't. He made people feel important when he talked to them. I didn't notice how dangerous that was until it was too late. The signs were small, but real. A report I wrote suddenly labeled Eric's Model. A client presentation I led suddenly narrated entirely by him. A budget proposal I submitted mysteriously appearing as a joint submission with his name first. I confronted him once. In the quiet corner of the break room, I said, "Why are you attaching your name to my documents?" He didn't even flinch. "It's not personal," he said. "Visibility matters. You've already got a niche here. I'm just trying to get on the radar." By taking credit for my work, he laughed. "Come on, man, we're a team." No anger, no guilt, just a calm dismissal, the kind that tells you the person has done this before and gotten away with it. I brushed it off. One incident, then another. I kept telling myself it wasn't worth a fight. Real work speaks for itself. But then came the meeting that changed everything, the one where the CEO announced she was restructuring leadership roles to reward stability and long-term commitment. I walked in unaware. Eric walked in with a smile. The board was on a video wall behind her, calling in from New York. The CEO had a stack of printouts, thick, heavy ones, and that fake warmth executives use when they're about to drop something they know will cause a reaction. She began with the usual corporate poetry about growth, alignment, and future forward vision. I'd sat through enough reorganizations to smell trouble, but even then, even after everything, I didn't expect the blow to come so cleanly. "We've decided," she said, turning to Eric, "that the $4 million division will now fall under your leadership." I felt the room tilt, but not because of the decision, because of the reason she gave next. "You've shown commitment, balance, and maturity, and as a father of two, you deserve stability." She said it warmly, like it was kindness, not theft. People nodded. Someone clapped softly. And Eric, in a move so rehearsed it made me sick, put a hand on my shoulder, and said, "I'll make sure your team's in good hands." My team, the one I'd built from nothing, the one I'd protected through layoffs and chaos, the one that trusted me. The CEO looked at me, expecting gratitude. The board watched, expecting compliance. Eric waited, expecting silence. And I did the one thing they least expected. I smiled. "Of course," I said. "Give it to the guy with kids." The tension in the room dissolved instantly. Her shoulders relaxed. Someone laughed. Eric exhaled in relief. They thought my smile meant surrender. They thought I accepted the role of the quiet workhorse who would keep building things for other people to take credit for. They didn't understand what that moment actually was. It was the last time I would give them anything for free. But that was just the beginning. They announced the transition on a Thursday. By Friday morning, Eric was already sitting at my desk. Not metaphorically, literally. He moved his laptop into my office before I even arrived. My nameplate was pushed aside, resting crooked on the windowsill like an object someone meant to throw away but got distracted. He looked up when I walked in. "Hey," he said, cheerful in that forced performative way. "Hope you don't mind. The CEO said it's better if I settle in fast. Continuity and all that." Continuity. A nice corporate word for erasure. I didn't answer. Not because I had nothing to say, because I knew exactly how these transitions work. Anything emotional would be used against me. In leadership conflicts, the quieter person always wins, but irritation simmered, the kind that doesn't need shouting, the kind that grows from 100 small cuts. He kept talking, pretending the awkwardness was my responsibility. "I'll need your workflow maps by Monday," he said, "and the vendor escalation contacts. Oh, and can you compile a summary of the last 2 quarters' risks? CEO wants me to hit the ground running." My work, my systems, my risk structures. He wanted me to hand over the engine I built so he could pretend he built it. I nodded once. "Send me a list," he grinned, thinking cooperation meant weakness. But that was just logistics, the surface tension of a deeper shift. By noon, HR emailed me a transition acknowledgement. By 2 p.m., my access level changed. By 4 p.m., the team I had hired was receiving meeting invites from Eric titled New Leadership Direction. 10 minutes after that, one of my coordinators, Sarah, came to my desk with eyes wide. "Is it true?" she whispered. "You're not leading us anymore?" I didn't want to drag the team into politics, but they deserved honesty. "Effective immediately," I said. "It wasn't performance-related." She tightened her jaw. "It never is." She walked out before I could reply. I didn't blame her. The next week was a parade of humiliations framed as necessities. Every time I opened a file, Eric's name was suddenly added. Every time I checked a dashboard, permissions were missing. Every time I reviewed a workflow, there was a recommendation from him scribbled in the margins, despite him not understanding half the architecture. But the moment that lit the fuse, the one I still feel in my teeth, happened at the Tuesday operations meeting. It used to be my domain. I built that meeting out of chaos. I knew every metric by heart. Now I sat 3 chairs down while Eric stood at the head of the table, mispronouncing the names of systems he'd never used. He clicked to a slide full of KPIs he didn't understand. KPIs I had stabilized, cleaned, and forecasted. "This model," he said, gesturing to a projection he'd clearly never opened, "is something I've been refining to bring clarity to long-term performance." My model, my logic, my formulas. He didn't even bother to change the naming conventions inside the spreadsheet. The columns still used my abbreviation style. Anyone who'd worked with me would recognize it instantly. And yet nobody said a word. Executives don't see the theft. They see the performance. I felt anger rise, but I kept my face still. Rage is a luxury. Quiet observation is a weapon. Halfway through the meeting, he hit a question he couldn't answer. The VP asked, "How does the variance swing back to baseline in Q3 if Q2 staffing lags by 8%? Eric froze, just 1 second. But in executive rooms, 1 second is a confession. He glanced at me. I didn't move. He stammered something about adjusted throughput factors, a phrase that sounds smart until someone asks for specifics. The VP frowned but let it go. Most leaders don't push unless the issue is existential. Later that day, Eric cornered me in the hallway. "You could have jumped in," he said, trying to sound authoritative. "I wasn't asked," I replied. He looked irritated. "You know this reflects on all of us." "No," I said quietly. "Only on the person presenting the work." He opened his mouth, then closed it. He wasn't used to someone pushing back without raising their voice. I was calm, but inside, something shifted. Not a breakdown, not defeat. A decision. For the first time since the restructuring, I saw the whole board. Not the literal executives, but the board of the game we were playing. Eric didn't understand the systems he inherited. The CEO handed him responsibilities he wasn't built to manage. The division wasn't stable by accident. It was stable because the foundations were precise, interconnected, and timed. And he had just started pulling bricks out without even knowing they were bricks. That night, working late in the half-emptied office, I opened the architecture map of the division for the first time in weeks. Not to sabotage. I would never damage my own work. But to understand how soon the cracks would appear without constant maintenance. I didn't need to hurt anything. I didn't need revenge. I just needed to step back. The truth was simple. They built the division on the assumption that I would always be there to catch what they ignored. And now I wasn't. I closed the dashboard. For the first time in years, I left the office at a normal hour. That small act, leaving, felt like its own kind of defiance. But I didn't know yet that this was the moment the cracks would begin to show, and the people who ignored me would hear them first. The cracks didn't explode. They whispered. At first, it was little things. An email from a long-term client about a missed callback. A quiet note from operations about a delivery that hit the SLA threshold. A ticket from support flagged as a repeat issue, unresolved root cause. Nothing dramatic. Nothing you could point to and say, here is where it all fell apart. But I recognized the pattern because I'd spent 2 years preventing it. The division I'd built was like an old industrial machine. Solid, efficient, temperamental. It worked beautifully as long as you respected its logic. Change one variable without understanding the dependencies and it wouldn't explode. It would just drift off course, 2 degrees at a time until you woke up in another country. Eric didn't believe in dependencies. He believed in quick wins. In his first month, he announced 3 of them. He consolidated 2 vendor contacts to streamline communication. I had kept them separate on purpose to avoid a single point of failure. He removed a secondary review step on complex invoices because it slowed down throughput. That step existed because one of our biggest clients used a billing structure that punished even small mistakes. And he reassigned my most experienced coordinator, Sarah, to a new strategic project that sounded important and meant nothing. I watched all of it happen from a distance. Technically, I wasn't in the division anymore. They moved me to cross-functional process optimization, which is corporate for, we don't want to fire you, but we don't know where to put you, now that we've given your work to someone more politically useful. They framed it as an opportunity. You're great at seeing the bigger picture, the CEO said in our one-on-one. Think of this as a chance to impact more than just one unit. I sat there, listening to her talk about visibility and strategic scope, while Eric sat in the glass office I used to occupy, backlit by the city skyline, running my division into a future he didn't understand. For a while, I did what I always did. I tried to fix things quietly. I stayed late a couple of nights, checking the dashboards, making sure the variance trends stayed within acceptable bands. I updated a couple of internal notes, added comments to forecast models, gently nudged an analyst in Eric's team to double-check some assumptions. Then one Tuesday afternoon, I joined a call I wasn't supposed to be on. It was with our largest client, a legacy account worth more than the entire division's annual revenue. I used to handle their escalations personally. I knew their quirks. The CFO who hated surprises, the operations director who cared more about process than price, the assistant who could kill an initiative with one sentence if she felt disrespected. I hadn't been invited. The meeting just appeared in my calendar as part of a recurring series that nobody had removed me from yet. I hovered over the decline button. Habit told me to join. Ego told me to stay away. I joined. When my camera flicked on, Eric blinked in surprise, then forced a smile. "Nice of you to dial in," he said. "We were just about to start." On the other side of the screen, the client team appeared. Familiar faces, tight expressions, the kind of look you see when people have given too many second chances. Their CFO didn't bother with small talk. "We've had 3 separate invoicing issues in 6 weeks, she said. "That hasn't happened in, 4 years?" She turned to her colleague for confirmation. He nodded stiffly. Eric launched into a polished explanation about transition periods and legacy settings. The words sounded good. They just didn't answer the question. The CFO cut him off. "Eric," she said, "we signed up for stability, not for you to blame the person who isn't even on these calls anymore." Her eyes shifted to me. "Where have you been?" she asked. "You used to catch these issues before they hit our side." The silence in that moment was louder than any argument. "I've been reassigned internally," I said. "I don't lead the division anymore." "Why?" One word, no padding. I could have lied. I could have smoothed it over, said something about restructuring and growth. Instead, I chose the only thing I had left: precision. "The company decided the division should be under new leadership," I said. I was moved to a different role. Nobody spoke for a few seconds. Then the CFO leaned back in her chair. "Well," she said quietly, "it shows." That was the first small fracture. The call ended with promises and timelines and the usual polite language. But when the screen went dark, the room we were in felt colder. Eric rounded on me the second the meeting closed. "You undermined me," he snapped. "You made it sound like I can't handle the role." "You're the one who removed the secondary invoice review," I said. "That control wasn't cosmetic," he scoffed. "You're still stuck in the weeds. This is about relationships." I looked at him. Really looked this time. He wasn't worried about the client's frustration. He was worried about how the CEO would react if she heard that the only person the client trusted was the one she'd pushed aside. "That client stayed because we caught problems before they did," I said. "That's the relationship." He stepped closer. "You want to be careful," he said softly. "If leadership thinks you're resentful, this new role of yours might not last." That was the moment something inside me finally cracked. Not because of the threat. I'd suspected from day one that this new job was temporary. But because of the realization that I'd spent years building safety nets for people who would gladly cut them to look efficient in a slide deck. I went home early that day. My apartment felt unfamiliar in the afternoon light. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at nothing, until my phone buzzed. It was a message from Sarah. "They just blamed old processes for the client mess," she wrote. "They put your name in the slide. You weren't there to defend yourself." I read that sentence 3 times. They weren't just taking my work. They were rewriting history so that every future problem could be pinned on the guy who wasn't in the room anymore. I thought about calling someone: HR, the CEO, the VP. But I knew how those conversations went. Soothing words, empathy, 0 change. Instead, I opened my laptop, not the company one, my own. I started pulling together everything I had kept out of habit. Not confidential data, not anything illegal, just my own work. The architecture diagrams I'd drawn on weekends, the risk memos I'd written and never sent, the models that showed how fragile the division was without certain controls. It took hours. Line by line, timestamp by timestamp, I watched my own history unfold. Every warning, every workaround, Every fix that had kept us off the radar of auditors and regulators and lawyers. Somewhere around midnight, I realized something that should have been obvious. I hadn't just built a division, I'd built a record. A quiet, detailed, time-stamped record of what worked, what failed, and who made which decisions when. For years, I'd used that knowledge to protect the company, to keep problems contained, to prevent people above me from facing the consequences of their shortcuts. And what had that loyalty bought me? A polite demotion? A stolen division? My name in a slide labeled Legacy Issues. I sat back, fingers hovering above the keyboard, and felt that last piece of my old self fall away. I wasn't their silent fixer anymore. I wasn't going to clean up messes I didn't make. I was done saving people who never wanted saving. So I did the one thing I'd never done before. I stopped thinking like an employee. I started thinking like someone who had leverage. I drafted an email, not angry, not dramatic, just precise, addressed to exactly 3 people: the VP, who actually cared about numbers, the internal compliance lead, and the head of enterprise risk. I attached one file, a simple, factual, unemotional summary of the controls that had been removed, the trend shifts we were already seeing, and the potential exposure if things continued. No accusations, no names, just this sentence at the end. If something breaks, you'll need to be able to show when you were first informed there was a crack. I hovered over send for a long time. Then I clicked. I closed the laptop, sat in the dark kitchen, and for the first time since the division was taken from me, I felt something other than anger or humiliation. I felt clarity. They thought I was out of the game. I'd just changed the rules. I didn't know it yet, but that email would decide who was still sitting in that glass office 6 months later, and who was explaining themselves to people who didn't care about charm. I expected the email to disappear into the void, like most warnings do in big companies. What I didn't expect was how fast the machine would start turning once someone outside Eric's orbit read it. The first sign came the next morning. A calendar invite hit my inbox. Variance review, mandatory attendance, organizer, enterprise risk, attendees, VP of strategy, compliance lead, 2 people from audit, and Eric. I stared at the names for a full minute. They never scheduled a meeting that wide unless they suspected a trend, not an incident. And trends meant data. And data meant accountability. By the time I walked into the conference room, the atmosphere was already tight. No small talk, no casual banter. Just spreadsheets projected onto a screen, and the kind of silence that tells you someone's story is about to collapse. Eric sat at the head of the table, smiling too widely, like a man who thinks charm can outrun math. The compliance lead opened the meeting. "We've been reviewing the stability metrics for the division," she said. "There are discrepancies we cannot ignore." She clicked to the first slide, a simple graph, 1 line, a slow, steady decline starting exactly 4 weeks after the leadership transition. The room went still. The VP turned to Eric. "What happened here?" Eric cleared his throat. "Growing pains, transition issues, we're adjusting." The VP didn't blink. "Why were 2 controls removed from invoice reviews?" Eric had rehearsed answers for everything except that. He glanced at me like I was supposed to jump in again and save him. I didn't move. The compliance lead pushed a printed memo toward him. "Your signature," she said. "Approve removal of secondary review to accelerate throughput." His name, his responsibility, his decision. He swallowed. "That was meant to be temporary." She didn't flinch. "Then why wasn't it reinstated after the first set of anomalies?" Silence. Numbers filled the screen, repeat incidents, SLA breaches, delayed callbacks, variance inconsistencies, all small but cumulatively damning. The kind of data only catches fire when someone has already struck a match. For a moment, watching Eric sweat under the fluorescent light, I almost felt pity. Almost. Halfway through the meeting, something shifted. Not in them, in me. Until that moment, I'd been bracing for them to somehow twist this back on me. corporate instinct, the reflex of someone who's been the quiet fixer too long. But as the review continued, a truth settled in my chest with a strange, cold clarity. They weren't looking at me. They were looking at him, and he knew it. When the client escalation slide appeared, 3 misses, 1 near breach, Eric finally snapped. "This isn't fair," he said, pointing toward me. "He built these processes. He designed the system. He should be answering for the VP cut him off. "He didn't remove the controls," she said sharply. "You did, and you can't have the authority without the accountability." Eric opened his mouth, but the VP continued. "And before you imply anything further, he hasn't been on your security whitelist for the division for 6 weeks. He couldn't modify these workflows even if he wanted to." That landed harder than anything I expected. I hadn't known they'd pulled my access that thoroughly. I also hadn't known they'd checked. The VP turned to me next. "Do you have anything to add?" I kept my voice steady, factual, unemotional, the opposite of what Eric expected. "I documented the risk assumptions behind every control when the system was built," I said. "Those documents are in the shared archive. Anyone could have reviewed them before making changes." No blame, no accusation, just architecture. Audit nodded. Compliance nodded. Even strategy nodded. Facts don't need volume. The meeting ended with a directive. Full audit of the division, weekly variance reviews, restoration of removed controls, and an escalation note to the CEO. Eric walked out pale. I walked out calm. But the storm wasn't in that room. It was waiting in the next. 2 hours later, my phone buzzed. It was Sarah. Short message. Just 1 line. "Client's coming in tomorrow. They asked specifically for you." My stomach tightened. Not fear. Recognition. Clients don't request individuals unless they want truth, not presentations. The next morning, the legacy client team arrived in person. That alone told me something was off. They rarely visited without scheduling weeks ahead. The CEO joined the meeting. So did the VP. So did Eric, visibly anxious. We all sat in the executive boardroom, the kind of room where reputations are made and destroyed. The client CFO started without preamble. "We've been reviewing your recent performance," she said, "and we have concerns." Eric launched into his script. "We're addressing the issues proactively." She raised a hand. "No, stop." He froze. She turned to me next. 2 seconds of eye contact. "You built the previous system," she said. "Explain what's happening now." The CEO stiffened. She didn't like anyone bypassing her hierarchy, but she couldn't interrupt. Not when the client controlling a multi-million-dollar contract asked a direct question. I explained exactly what changed. Not dramatically, not emotionally, just fact by fact. Control removed, workload shifted, dependencies ignored, delays triggered. The client team listened without blinking. When I finished, the CFO closed her folder. "This confirms what we suspected," she said. Instability didn't come from legacy processes. It came from leadership decisions. Every pair of eyes in the room shifted to Eric. He looked like someone standing on a frozen lake, hearing the cracks beneath him. The CEO tried to intervene. "Let's not overreact. We're correcting—" The CFO cut her off again. "We value the system your former manager built," she said, "but we do not accept leadership that jeopardizes it. Either you put the person who understands this division back in oversight," a pause, deliberate, heavy, "or we reconsider our contract." Silence, heavy, expensive, career-ending silence. The CEO's face drained of color. Eric didn't breathe, and I realized something slowly, like a door opening. This wasn't chaos. This was consequences. Their choices catching up with them in a room where charm couldn't help and politics couldn't save them. Later that day, I got another meeting request, this one from the CEO herself. Subject line, "We need to discuss next steps." And then a forwarded audit note, already marked urgent. "Preliminary findings indicate leadership failures, not system flaws." They thought I was gone. I wasn't, and the cracks they ignored were no longer mine to hold together. By the time I walked into the CEO's office, the world inside the company had already shifted. The air felt different, tighter, quieter, like everyone was holding their breath. Corporate buildings always know when something is dying. The CEO sat at her desk with a stack of papers in front of her. Not printouts for a meeting, not strategy documents, audit notes. She didn't look up right away. When she did, her expression wasn't angry or defensive. It was tired, the kind of tired you see in someone who just realized they backed the wrong person for too long. "Close the door," she said. I did. She gestured to the chair across from her. I sat. She didn't waste time. "I didn't know things had deteriorated this fast," she began. "Audit's findings. They're serious." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. She wasn't talking to me. She was talking through the wreckage. She flipped through the pages. "The client's ultimatum put us in a corner," she continued. "They want you involved again. They were extremely clear about that." Another pause. "They trust you." It wasn't flattery. It wasn't apology. It was admission. The first real one she'd ever given me. But I didn't let her off that easily. "Trust isn't about who sits in the big office," I said. "It's about who understands what they're responsible for." She exhaled, long and slow. Then, surprisingly, "You were right about the controls." It wasn't enough to undo what she'd done, but it mattered, not for ego, for truth. She tapped the audit report. "They concluded the issues began after leadership changes. They can verify exactly when each change happened, who approved it, and what impact it had." Meaning, Eric had left a trail, a long time-stamped, documented trail. And now it was catching up. I waited. "What do you want from me?" she asked finally. A question she should have asked 6 weeks earlier. Once I would have said I wanted my division back. Once I would have said I wanted acknowledgement, or fairness, or respect. But that man, the one who thought loyalty was rewarded, was gone. "I want a role where my work is aligned with my authority," I said, "where I'm not cleaning up messes for someone else's promotion, and where decisions about my responsibilities are made with me, not around me." She nodded slowly. "That's reasonable," she said. It was more than reasonable. It was overdue. She leaned back. "We can reassign the division to you," she said, careful. "Temporarily, until we stabilize things." I shook my head. "I don't want the title. I want the oversight." She blinked, surprised. "Define oversight." "Risk mapping, process architecture, decision approval on critical controls, direct client communication for Tier 1 accounts." A beat, and I choose my own team. Her expression shifted, not resistance but realization. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a blueprint, one she could either adopt or lose a multi-million-dollar client over. Finally, she said, "Done." Just like that, not because she valued me, but because reality did. As I stood to leave, she said one more thing. "We'll talk separately about Eric." I didn't ask for details. I didn't need to. But I found them out anyway. Not through gossip, but through procedure. Audit flagged him for poor controls management. Compliance flagged him for misrepresenting system changes. Strategy flagged him for deteriorating client confidence. HR flagged him for unsustainable leadership outcomes. By the end of the week, he was transitioned out. Not fired, not escorted by security. Just quietly removed from the place he'd tried to climb, without doing the work. He left early on a Wednesday carrying a single box. I didn't watch him go. I didn't need that moment. It wasn't revenge. It was consequence. The following Monday, I met with the client team again. This time the tone was different. The CFO shook my hand and said, "We appreciate the transparency, and the corrective plan looks solid. We went through every control, every dependency, every nuance. Nothing political, nothing embellished. Just two teams rebuilding trust the way it always should have been built. With facts, not performance. After the meeting, Sarah caught up with me in the hallway. "You're back?" she asked. "In a different way," I said. She nodded. "Good." For the first time in months, the office didn't feel like an arena. It felt neutral, honest. The fluorescent lights didn't sting as much. The silence didn't echo. That evening, I stayed a little later. Not because I had to, because I wanted to. I reopened the architecture map of the division, the one I'd built piece by piece, line by line, year after year. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel ownership. I felt clarity. I didn't need the title. I didn't need the recognition. I had something far more valuable. Control over my own work. Authority that matched responsibility. A company that finally understood the cost of taking the quiet person for granted. I wasn't the hero. I wasn't the victim. I wasn't the guy who kept everyone else's chaos together. I was simply the person who stopped saving people from themselves. And when I left that night, lights off, laptop bag over my shoulder, I felt something I hadn't felt since before the restructuring. Peace. Not relief. Not triumph. Peace. The kind that comes not from winning, but from walking away from a game you should have never been forced to play. The CEO handed the Forma Ballers division to her favorite because he has kids. I smiled. And in the end, she gave me something much better than a title. She gave me back my freedom and took away everything from the person who tried to take my work.